Okay, when we talk about the nervous system, we actually have three separate components, and they're named differently, all named nervous systems. So one overall nervous system, three categories: the somatic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and the central nervous system. So the somatic nervous system, this mostly covers sensory information coming in and then motor information going back out. So our voluntary actions. You move your hand away from the heat because it's hot. Um, that sort of thing. The autonomic nervous system, this is the involuntary function of the body. Things like breathing, your heartbeat, things that are not under conscious control, things that are involuntary functions. And then finally, the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, the components that most of us are probably most familiar with. So a little bit more about the somatic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system is going to control those voluntary actions. If you're fidgeting in your seat while you're listening to the lecture, or maybe you're walking on your treadmill while you're listening to it, those are all voluntary actions controlled by the nervous system. It's going to be the part of the nervous system that carries sensory information, temperature, sight, smell, sound, into the central nervous system, and then also carries that movement information back out to the peripheral nerves. So when we talk about that information being carried, we're talking once again about action potentials. And in this case, the particular neurotransmitter that we're talking about when we talk about movement is acetylcholine. So another quick video to show us how that works. Here's the information.
An action potential arrives at the presynaptic terminal, causing voltage-gated calcium ion channels to open, increasing the calcium ion permeability of the presynaptic terminal cell membrane. Calcium ions enter the presynaptic terminal and cause vesicles to release their neurotransmitter acetylcholine from the synaptic vesicles into the presynaptic cleft. Diffusion of acetylcholine across the synaptic cleft and binding of acetylcholine to acetylcholine receptors on the postsynaptic muscle fiber membrane causes an increase in the permeability of ligand-gated sodium ion channels. The movement of sodium ions into the muscle cell results in depolarization of the postsynaptic membrane. Once threshold has been reached, a postsynaptic action potential is generated and is propagated over the muscle cell membrane. Acetylcholine is rapidly broken down to acetic acid and choline in the synaptic cleft by the enzyme acetylcholine esterase. The choline is reabsorbed by the presynaptic terminal and combined with acetic acid to form more acetylcholine, which enters the synaptic vesicles.
So that's how that process would be happening if you were moving your hand or moving your legs or moving any kind of muscle fiber in your body. Here we see the end of a neuron connecting to muscle fiber, and we see that same process of transmitting information along the ends of the axon terminals. Okay, so that's our somatic nervous system. Next, we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system, this is all of our internal and involuntary functions, our heart rate, our blood pressure, all those things that we can't control. Now, we do see many important psychoactive drugs that are going to affect the autonomic nervous system. When we think about drugs that suppress respiration, breathing being a function of the autonomic nervous system, we can see how this particular system is one that we especially worry about, because if we see heart rate or respiration begin to drop, we're talking about somebody's life being in danger. So the autonomic nervous system actually has two branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branch. And these sometimes act in opposition. So just because we know it's involving the autonomic nervous system doesn't necessarily mean that it's something that involves decreasing heart rate or respiration. It may actually be increased as well. All right, so finally the central nervous system, the one that most of us are probably most familiar with, the brain and the spinal cord. Of course, these components of the central nervous system have many, many functions. The core of our personality, integration of information, learning, memory, coordinating activities, our judgment, emotions, all of these things are based in the brain and the central nervous system. And we are going to be talking all semester long about drugs affecting these components of the central nervous system as well. So digging into the brain a little bit more in detail, we're going to be looking throughout the semester at specific chemical pathways in the brain, ways that drugs can either interfere or amplify certain chemical pathways. So we'll talk about a few. We'll start with dopamine. That tends to be one that people are familiar with. Dopamine actually has two separate pathways in the brain, the mesolimbic and the nigrostriatal. So when we talk about a pathway, I'll take a look at our brain diagram here. We are actually talking about a path from one part of the brain to the other. So if we look at the dopamine pathways, we're looking at the path from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens, or from the substantia nigra to the striatum. So we can see how there are actual pathways. When we talk about this, it's not a theoretical thing. It's an actual way that action potentials move from one part of the brain to the other. All right, so back to dopamine. We hear about the dopamine reward system. We talk about things that making us feel good, wanting us to make us do them more often. And it's possible that this is part of how the reward system of drug dependence functions. We'll be talking about that throughout the semester. When we talk about that other dopamine pathway, the nigrostriatal, now we're talking about a pathway that's involved in Parkinson's disease. So one of the things that we'll see as we move through this information on chemical pathways and neurotransmitters, this is all very new and emerging science, and you'll see the word proposed and expected often. There's a lot that we don't know, and there's some very exciting things that we're learning. So we don't know everything there is to know about the brain. We've barely started to scratch the surface. But what we are starting to learn is very exciting. Okay, so moving on from dopamine, norepinephrine also has multiple pathways. Norepinephrine, here we're talking about arousal and attentiveness. It also is expected to have some relationship with food intake and appetite, and we see it related to stimulant drugs as well. Our next neurotransmitter, serotonin. This is one that we talk about being related to depression. A lack of serotonin has been associated with depression in some studies, and we think it may also have a role with impulsivity and aggression, and then also possibly with control of food and alcohol intake. We do know that hallucinogenic drugs such as LSD definitely influence serotonin pathways, and we'll be talking more about that during our section on hallucinogenic drugs. We talked a little bit about acetylcholine already, its connection with the neuromuscular connection, and we know that it's also involved with Alzheimer's disease. And if you think about some of the symptoms of that disease, it should follow kind of naturally that it's also associated with learning and memory. And then finally, endorphins. You may have heard of endorphins when we talk about the runner's high or the positive effects of exercise on the body. And endorphin is actually a naturally occurring opioid-like chemical. So when we talk about our opioid drugs, we'll see how those pathways are related. So endorphins, which occur naturally in our body, play a similar role when it comes to pain relief. GABA, this one we'll find almost everywhere in the brain, and we'll talk about it in relationship with many drugs, and then the same thing with glutamate. So those will come up with many of the different drugs that we talk about this semester. Okay, so here's a summary of the neurotransmitters that we talked about, the central nervous system changes that they can be involved with, and then the drugs of abuse that they're associated with. So for instance, our neurotransmitter is dopamine. We know that levels of dopamine are related to changes associated with euphoria, agitation, and paranoia. And then we also see the neurotransmitters in the same pathways being associated with drugs of abuse such as amphetamines and cocaine. So you can see how those dots start to come together to form a pattern, and these will be patterns that we come back to throughout the semester as we talk about the effects of drugs on the central nervous system.